I knew the moment I saw the koi gasping near the surface that something was wrong. The pump in my backyard fish pond had gone silent. No bubbling, no humming, just still, stagnant water and a growing sense of dread. I jogged across the yard and saw the plug hanging out of the socket like someone had yanked it mid-cycle. That someone was definitely not me. I live in a quiet cul-de-sac in Westfield Estates, where the HOA has a tighter grip than a python on a rat. I've dealt with their nonsense before, warnings about non-compliant mailbox paint and unauthorized wind chimes. But this was sabotage. Then I spotted the tiny, dusty footprint in the mulch near the pump housing. Bingo! I didn't even need to guess who did it. Frances Alder, the HOA vice president and self-proclaimed neighborhood integrity monitor. She's exactly what you'd expect. Mid-50s, pearl earrings, and a glare that could curdle milk. She's the type who complains about unapproved flower species and once wrote up a report because someone's kid left a basketball hoop out overnight. My name's Nolan Brooks, and I'm not the kind of man who lets things slide, especially not when it involves my property and my fish. So I did what any rational homeowner would do. I installed a motion-triggered camera on the back fence, right above the pump. It blended in with the ivy and had night vision, audio, and a direct Wi-Fi feed to my phone. I didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, at exactly 6:17 a.m., I caught her, Frances, dressed in a pastel tracksuit and dragging her stupid little clipboard, crept into my backyard like a raccoon with a grudge. She didn't hesitate. She walked straight to the pump, looked around, and yanked the plug again. Then she mumbled something into the air, something about noise violations and setting an example. And just like that, she shuffled off. I stared at the footage, jaw clenched. She had trespassed onto my property and deliberately tampered with my equipment. That wasn't just an HOA nuisance, it was criminal. I printed the footage, burned a copy onto a USB stick, and drove straight to the police station. The officer at the desk raised an eyebrow when I gave him the report. "She did what now?" I played the video. "Oh," he said, nodding slowly. "Yeah, that's trespassing all right. And if that pump's essential to the well-being of the animals in the pond, that's criminal mischief too." He took the statement, the footage, and said they'd be following up. I left the station feeling like someone had finally lifted a weight off my chest. But I knew Frances wasn't going to take this quietly. Sure enough, that afternoon she marched up to my porch like she owned the block. Clipboard in one hand, fake smile stretched across her face. "Nolan," she said, voice sugary and tight. "We've received several complaints about a noise coming from your backyard. Likely that pump. You'll need to remove it within 72 hours or face a fine." I folded my arms. "Funny, because I just filed criminal charges against you for trespassing and tampering with said pump." "Want to see the footage?" Her smile faltered. "You're bluffing," she snapped. I pulled out my phone and hit play. There she was in full HD, yanking the plug with the grace of a petty thief, her face drained of color. "You stepped into my yard, messed with my property twice," I said. "That's not a noise complaint, Frances. That's a crime." She turned and stormed off without another word. Later that evening, I got a call from Officer Delgado. "Just letting you know, Mr. Brooks, we're issuing a summons. She'll be facing charges for trespassing and vandalism." Good work collecting that footage. Good work indeed, but Frances wasn't just a rogue neighbor. She was the HOA, and the HOA didn't like being challenged. Things were about to get worse. The next morning, I woke to the sound of gravel crunching. I pulled the curtain back just slightly enough to see a white sedan I didn't recognize idling in front of my house. A man in a navy blazer stepped out, holding a thick folder under his arm. He didn't knock. Instead, he walked straight to my mailbox, opened it, and shoved the folder inside before returning to his car. I retrieved it before the engine even cooled. The logo on the front read, "Westfield Estates Property Management Legal Affairs Division." Inside was a letter, written in stiff legalese, accusing me of malicious defamation of a board member, unauthorized surveillance, and dissemination of private footage. They were demanding a formal apology to Francis and threatening civil litigation if I did not comply within 5 days. I reread it twice. They were insane. I dropped the packet on my kitchen table and called my cousin, Maya. She's a municipal attorney in the next county and has a particular disdain for HOAs. She answered on the second ring. "You're being threatened with legal action." "For catching someone committing a crime? They're calling it defamation and illegal surveillance." "Let me guess, they're citing HOA bylaws, not actual state law." "Exactly," she laughed, short and sharp. "They're bluffing. Your backyard isn't a common area, and you have every right to install a camera on your own property. Plus, Francis had no legal authority to be there. If anything, you've got grounds to sue them." "I was hoping you'd say that. Do not respond to that letter directly. Send everything to me. I'll draft a formal reply and CC their legal rep. If they push this, we'll file a counterclaim." By the time I hung up, the anxiety had been replaced by a low, satisfying burn. They were trying to scare me off. That meant they were cornered. Later that afternoon, I drove over to City Hall. If the HOA was willing to escalate, I needed backup. I met with Councilman Reeves, a practical guy who'd helped me once before when a neighbor tried to claim part of my side yard was communal. I laid out the situation for him, including the footage, the charges filed, and the retaliatory legal threats. He listened, tapping his pen against a folder. "They've done this to others," he said finally. "Not to this level, but I've taken calls. A woman on East Ridge had her garden dug up. Another guy got fined for parking his own work van in his driveway. The board counts on people not knowing the law. Maybe it's time we remind them." He handed me a packet. "Here. It's the original HOA charter from when the subdivision was incorporated. Most people don't even know this version exists. It's been amended beyond recognition since then, but these clauses still hold weight in court. One clause in particular caught my eye. No board member shall initiate or enforce any policy resulting in property entry without consent or emergency cause." Francis had violated that in broad daylight and on camera. I made 3 copies of the charter and highlighted the relevant section in each. Then I started knocking on doors. My neighbors are a mix of families, retirees, and a few quiet professionals who mostly keep to themselves. I figured most of them had no idea what Francis and the board were really doing. The first person to open up was Mr. Lehane, a retired Air Force mechanic with a habit of whistling as he worked on his immaculate lawnmower collection. "Francis," he said when I explained what happened. "She fined me last year for excessive workshop noise. I was tightening bolts on a Sunday morning. I didn't fight it because I didn't want the drama." I showed him the footage. He let out a low whistle. "You're telling me she just walked in like that? No notice, no call, twice. You getting a petition together, something better. I want them out." He nodded. "You've got my signature." By dusk, I had 12 more. I met Meyer at her office after hours. She had already drafted the response to their threat letter, complete with citations from state trespass statutes and civil rights precedents. But she'd gone a step further. "They've filed over 70 fines in the past year." I pulled the public record. "Most of them are disproportionately issued by Francis, and nearly all are for vague aesthetic violations. There's a pattern here." She flipped her laptop around to show me a spreadsheet. "See these? Every fine over $200. She's been funneling them into a beautification fund that doesn't appear on the annual report. She's been skimming. No, worse. She's using that fund to hire private contractors, one of whom is her nephew. No bids, no disclosures. That's contract fraud." That night, I compiled everything: the footage, the original charter, the legal response, and Maya's research. Then I sent it to every homeowner in Westfield Estates. By morning, my inbox was exploding. People were furious, some hadn't even known they were being fined. Others had been too intimidated to fight back, but now they had proof. At noon, the HOA called an emergency board meeting at the community center. Usually, these meetings drew maybe 10 people. This time, over 50 showed up. Francis arrived late, looking disheveled for the first time in memory. She walked in with a folder under one arm and a forced calm on her face. The rest of the board looked nervous. They had reason to be. Councilman Reeves attended as a guest observer, sitting silently in the back row. When the meeting opened, Francis tried to speak first. "We've called this session to address recent misinformation spread online. I stood. Point of order. According to Article V, Section 3 of the Charter, any homeowner may present evidence of misconduct before the board. I have such evidence." The room fell silent. I walked to the front and handed copies of the documents to the board members. Then I connected my laptop to the projector and played the footage. Gasps echoed through the room. When it ended, I turned to the crowd. This wasn't an isolated incident. The vice president of this board trespassed onto my property and tampered with equipment sustaining live animals. She then attempted to retaliate through falsified legal threats. We now know this is part of a larger pattern, one that involves potential financial misconduct and contract favoritism. Francis tried to cut me off. "That's enough. You're not authorized to." Councilman Reeves stood. "Actually, he is. And given the number of people here, I'd say a quorum's been met. I recommend the board votes on whether to suspend Vice President Alder pending investigation." The crowd erupted in agreement. The board, cornered and visibly panicked, voted 4-1 to suspend her effective immediately. Francis didn't even wait for the gavel. She grabbed her folder and stormed out, nearly knocking over a folding chair. As people filtered out, neighbors I barely knew came up to shake my hand, clap me on the shoulder, or just nod in quiet gratitude. For the first time in years, the HOA wasn't something to fear. But this wasn't over. Meyer and I were preparing a formal complaint to the State Homeowner Association Oversight Board. There were financial records to audit, contracts to review, and bylaws that needed rewriting. The board had built its power on silence and intimidation. Now that silence was broken. 3 days after Francis was suspended, a letter arrived from the HOA's law firm, a new one. Apparently, the board had quietly dropped their previous counsel without any announcement. They were now claiming full cooperation with the city's investigation and invited me to attend a special transparency session to discuss community reforms. I didn't buy it. It read more like a PR stunt than an olive branch. Still, I went not for them, but for the neighbors who had backed me up. They deserved to see how the board handled accountability when the spotlight was on them. The meeting was held in the gymnasium at the middle school across the highway, a neutral venue with enough space for the nearly 80 residents who showed. The board sat at a table up front, notably missing Francis. In her place was a younger man named Devin Marks, newly appointed as interim vice president. He looked like someone who had never expected to hold power and was already regretting it. Councilman Reeves was again seated near the back, legal pad in hand. Devin stood first. "We want to begin by acknowledging the recent events, and we're committed to restoring trust. We've retained an external auditor to review all HOA financial activity from the past 5 years. We also voted to freeze all fines issued in the last 6 months pending independent review." Maya leaned toward me from her seat beside the aisle. "That's a CYA move if I've ever seen one. They're hoping to stall." I didn't wait for the microphone. "What about the contracts awarded to relatives of former board members? Are those under review too?" Devin hesitated. "Those arrangements are being evaluated." "Have those payments stopped?" an older woman from the third row called out, "because my dues are still going up." "I'd like to know where that money's going." Another man chimed in. "And if Francis was siphoning funds into unauthorized accounts, what's being done about criminal charges?" The board floundered, clearly unprepared for that level of direct questioning. But the real fireworks started when a woman near the exit raised her hand and said, "I work at the county clerk's office. Last year, I processed an amended covenant application from this HOA. It included language allowing board members to authorize emergency access to private property. I flagged it because it didn't match the original charter. Gasps rippled through the crowd. She continued, "When I asked for supporting documents, I was emailed a scanned vote approval sheet, but the signatures looked off. I ran the names through our system. 6 of them were for properties that had been vacant for over a year." Maya stood. "That's document fraud. If those signatures were used to pass a bylaw change and they weren't from current residents, that's a felony." Devin looked like he might faint. Councilman Reeves rose and spoke calmly, but with unmistakable authority. "I'll be requesting a full audit of the HOA's voting records and procedural history. If any falsified documents were submitted to the county to justify policy changes, there will be consequences. Criminal ones." By the end of the meeting, the board had agreed to suspend all enforcement activities and turn over financial records to the city within 5 business days. But I wasn't done. Back at home, I dug into the digital copies of the HOA's old newsletters and community bulletins. Buried in the folder was a scanned flyer from 2 years ago, an announcement of a community beautification vote held during a weekday afternoon, with no mention of absentee ballots. That vote was the same one used to justify the emergency access rule the clerk had flagged. I forwarded everything to Maya, who passed it on to the district attorney's office. Within 48 hours, detectives arrived at the HOA's management office with a warrant. The fallout was immediate. The city froze the HOA's operating account. Frances was served with a subpoena at her home. A second board member, the treasurer, resigned and left town within 24 hours. Her name had appeared on several of the forged signature forms. Then came the bombshell. One of the contractors who'd done landscaping work for the HOA came forward to avoid prosecution. He admitted under oath that he'd been paid in cash for jobs that were never completed. Often, he said, he'd be told to submit fake invoices for projects that didn't exist, like drainage line clearing behind Lot 14, which was actually a vacant parcel next to a storm ditch. The cash, he claimed, came directly from the beautification fund. That was the final nail. The district attorney announced a formal investigation into misappropriation of HOA funds, forgery, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Frances was arrested 2 weeks later, charged with multiple felonies. She posted bail, but her mugshot made the rounds in every group chat from here to the next county over. I thought things might settle down after that. But the residents weren't just angry, they were energized. A petition circulated calling for the dissolution of the current board and the establishment of a temporary oversight committee made up of volunteers from the community. I signed it, along with over 70 others. Councilman Reeves met with us the following weekend in the community park. "If you want to take control of your HOA," he said, "you need to follow the rules they've been ignoring. That means a special election, properly noticed with certified ballots and observers. I'll help make sure it's done right." We held the election 3 weeks later. Every position was challenged. Every vote was counted under supervision. Not a single former board member was re-elected. I didn't run. I'd had more than enough of HOA politics for one lifetime. But I did support a neighbor named Carla, a retired nurse who had once been fined for having a raised garden bed. She won the presidency by a landslide, the first act of the new board. Removing several obscure rules that had been used to justify fines for things like visible trash bins and non-standard porch furniture. The second act was commissioning an independent audit of the last 5 years' finances. No more secret funds. No more relatives getting contracts. No more trespassing. The koi pond in my backyard now hums quietly, the pump running uninterrupted, just as it should. The ivy-covered camera still sits on the fence, not out of paranoia, but as a quiet reminder. Power only grows in silence. But when people speak, organize, and shine a light, even the most entrenched corruption starts to crack. I hadn't set out to change the neighborhood. I just wanted to protect my fish. But sometimes the smallest ripples carry the furthest. The frost came early that year. Thin sheets of ice clung to the top of the koi pond every morning, breaking up by noon as the sun finally warmed the slate stones around the water. I'd added a backup power supply and a locking cover for the pump box just in case. Not that anyone was sneaking into my yard anymore. That era was over. The neighborhood had changed. The new board, led by Carla, was methodical, slow to act, but deliberate. They weren't interested in grandstanding. They wanted stability, transparency, and healing. But after everything we'd uncovered, there were still loose threads that didn't sit right. Carla called me one evening just as I was finishing up replacing one of the security lights on the garage. She didn't waste time with pleasantries. "There's something off in the old maintenance invoices," she said. I adjusted the ladder with one hand and braced the phone to my shoulder. "You mean the fake landscaping jobs?" "No, this is different. It's about the stormwater project from last year, the one they said was mandatory." I climbed down and sat on the hood of my truck. "That pipe replacement on the west end. They billed every homeowner $200 for it. But the city says they never issued a permit for construction, and the utility records show no new lines installed." I whistled quietly. "So where did the money go?" "That's what I want to find out." Carla had been digging through the archived records. The previous board tried to erase documents recovered from a corrupted flash drive found stuck in the back of a desk drawer in the HOA office. She'd been restoring them with help from her nephew, a computer science major at the university. What they found pointed to something bigger than we expected. There were receipts from a shell company, Rivertown Infrastructure Services, that had been listed as the contractor for the stormwater work. The problem? It didn't exist. No license, no tax ID, no employee listings. Just a P.O. box in a strip mall 2 towns over. It wasn't just a fake job. It was a laundering scheme. Maya took one look at the documents and drove straight to the district attorney's office. The assistant DA confirmed our suspicions. The shell company's mailing address had appeared in a separate fraud case 3 years earlier, unrelated to HOAs. That case had gone cold after the trail ran dry, until now. A week later, detectives from the county's financial crimes unit showed up at the homes of 2 former board members, one of whom had quietly relocated to a rental property on the other side of the city. Both were taken in for questioning. Then something unexpected happened. At the next community meeting, a man stood up in the back row. Late 40s, worn denim jacket, and a quiet demeanor. His name was Elias Durant, and he'd been hired by the HOA 3 years ago as a handyman, one of the few legitimate workers who actually performed services. "My name was used on those Rivertown invoices," he said. "I didn't know until last week. I never got paid for storm drain work. I never did any. But someone forged my name and signature on those receipts." Carla leaned forward. "Do you know who submitted the paperwork?" Elias nodded slowly. "Frances. She told me not to worry about the forms, said she was streamlining the process. I didn't think much of it, but now I know they were using my name to make it look legit." The room went dead silent. Elias handed over a stack of his original invoices, all handwritten, signed, and showing none of the stormwater work from the fake project. It was the last piece of the puzzle. The grand jury didn't take long. 3 former board members, including Francis, were indicted on felony charges: wire fraud, falsification of public records, conspiracy to defraud, and money laundering. The amounts totaled over $75,000 stolen incrementally from homeowners through fabricated projects, bogus fines, and fake emergency assessments. Francis was arrested again, this time without bail. The trial was set 6 months out, but the consequences rippled through the entire region. Local news ran a segment on HOA corruption in the suburbs, and Westfield Estates became the center of a cautionary tale, but the neighborhood didn't shrink from the attention. Quite the opposite. Carla's board implemented a full transparency system. Every invoice, every expenditure, every board discussion was logged through a public portal. Residents could watch live streams of meetings, submit questions in advance, and vote on proposed changes digitally. It wasn't perfect, but it was light years ahead of where we'd been. I didn't show up to every meeting, but I stayed involved. I helped Elias rebuild his reputation. He'd lost work after being unknowingly linked to the fraud. We set up a small online profile for him, and neighbors started booking him directly for odd jobs. He built a new retaining wall for the Wellingtons on the corner and rewired an entire garage for the Nguyens down the street. He told me one afternoon while replacing a busted gate hinge at my place, "I used to think I was just a name on a list. Now people knock on my door again." Something else shifted too. The people who used to keep their heads down, the ones who paid fines without questioning, who avoided eye contact when Francis walked by, they started speaking up. Not just about the past, but about what they wanted the neighborhood to become. The empty lot where Francis once proposed building a private garden with HOA funds was turned into a shared green space, planters, benches, and even a community tool shed. Someone donated paint for a mural, and kids from the local high school came out on a Saturday to paint it. It was a depiction of the koi pond under a starry sky with the words "We watch, we care, we act" stenciled at the bottom. I didn't ask for that, but it meant something. As winter settled in, I hosted a small bonfire in the backyard. Nothing fancy, just a fire pit, folding chairs, and a few crockpots borrowed from neighbors. People brought food, stories, and for the first time in a long time, laughter that wasn't tinged with tension. Maya came by late, boots muddy and hands full of cider. She sat next to me and stared into the fire for a while before speaking. "You know," she said, "I've worked fraud cases for years, but this one hit different. It wasn't about money, not really. No, it was about control. They built a system where people gave up without realizing it. You just happened to be the one who said no loud enough to wake everyone up." I didn't say anything. Just added another log to the fire and watched the embers float upward. Eventually, the trial came and went. Francis was convicted on all counts. The judge called her actions a deliberate erosion of community trust through deception and self-interest. She was sentenced to 7 years in state prison, a harsh penalty, but one that sent a message. The others took plea deals. Community service, restitution payments, and permanent bans from serving on any HOA board in the state. Their names were scrubbed from the charter, their influence gone like smoke in the wind. Life moved on. The koi thrived through the winter, thanks to the new insulated housing and a proper heater for the pond. No one unplugged the pump again. No HOA official trespassed. No clipboard hovered over flower beds or driveway cracks. People still disagreed. But now they did it face to face, with respect and rules that made sense. And me, I stopped feeling like I was waiting for the next shoe to drop. The cameras stayed up, but I spent more time tending the garden than watching the feed. The fight had changed me, not just how I saw my home, but how I saw what it meant to be part of a neighborhood. Not every battle is about winning. Sometimes, it's just about refusing to be quiet. And when one person speaks up, it turns out others were just waiting for someone to go first.